Not a warning shot, not a message, an answer. 8 nights of silence broken by something bigger than anything that came before it. Somewhere over Iranian airspace tonight, multiple aircraft moved in perfect sequence, different platforms, different roles, all converging on the same set of targets within the same narrow window of time. And by the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why Iran's military leadership is running out of options tonight. Welcome back to the channel, my friend. I'm Dr. Lee. If you're new here, this is the place where we break down what's really happening in the world's most dangerous conflicts, without the noise and without the spin. Before we get into it, if you've been watching for a while and this channel has become part of your routine, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Consider it your way of saying, keep going, Dr. Lee, I want to hear more. And I'd love to know, drop it in the comments, where are you watching from today? I read every single one, and it means a lot to see just how far this reaches. Now, let's get into it. The night began quietly over Iran. Then it didn't. Within the span of a few hours, American forces carried out what defense officials are describing as the most significant strike package of this entire campaign. Not a single aircraft, not a single target. A coordinated multi-domain operation hitting several categories of infrastructure at once. Missile production facilities buried under mountainous terrain, command centers directly tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and radar installations along the coast that had been tracking American naval movement for weeks. For those who have followed this conflict closely, the pattern has been building for days, each night slightly larger than the one before it, each strike slightly more direct. But tonight felt different, and it wasn't just the scale, it was the language. For the first time since this campaign began, U.S. Central Command used a word they had deliberately avoided until now. Retaliation, not deterrence, not defensive posture, not a measured response, retaliation. That single word shift matters more than almost anything else that happened tonight, because it tells you exactly what triggered this. According to official statements released just hours ago, American service members were killed in an attack days earlier. A coordinated strike involving ballistic missiles and drones aimed at a forward base outside Iran's borders. When American lives are lost, the entire framing of a military campaign changes. Deterrence campaigns exist to send messages. Retaliation campaigns exist to deliver consequences. And tonight, consequences are exactly what arrived. Let's talk about how this actually happened, because understanding the mechanics tells you more about American intent than any press release ever could. Think of tonight's operation less like a single punch and more like a relay race, where each runner has one very specific job. And the entire sequence only works if each handoff happens at exactly the right moment. The first aircraft into contested airspace tonight didn't carry a single bomb. Their job wasn't destruction. Their job was silence. Electronic warfare aircraft moved in first, and their function is almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. The moment an Iranian radar system attempts to lock onto an incoming aircraft, these platforms respond in one of two ways. Either they flood that radar signal with so much electronic noise that the operator's screen becomes unreadable static, or they trace the signal back to its source and fire a missile that rides that beam home. Either way, the result is the same. The enemy's eyes go dark. Analysts who study air campaigns will tell you this is the least visible phase of any operation, and, at the same time, the most important one. Nothing that follows works properly without it. If Iranian air defense can see incoming aircraft clearly, the entire mission becomes exponentially more dangerous for American pilots. If they can't see anything at all, everything downstream becomes safer. Once that electronic corridor opened up, the second wave moved in, and this is where precision becomes the priority. Multi-role fighter aircraft, some models that have quietly served for decades, are typically responsible for the close-range, high-accuracy portion of a strike like this. These aircraft don't rely on overwhelming firepower. They rely on exact targeting, a specific building, a specific structure, sometimes a specific room within that structure, using guided munitions programmed with intelligence gathered hours or even days before the mission ever launched. This is the phase responsible for hitting command buildings, radar stations, and fixed installations that require accuracy over raw destructive power. According to sources familiar with tonight's operation, this is also the phase that struck facilities tied directly to Revolutionary Guard leadership. Not just their equipment, but the infrastructure their command structure depends on. That distinction matters enormously. It's one thing to lose weapons. It's an entirely different psychological experience to feel like your own leadership has become the target. Then came the third and final piece of tonight's sequence. The one built for scale, long-range bomber aircraft, some in continuous service for well over half a century, played a different role entirely. Rather than flying directly into contested airspace, these aircraft remained far outside the most dangerous zones, releasing long-range guided munitions that travel low along the terrain before locking onto their targets independently. This allows a single aircraft to strike multiple locations across a wide geographic area without ever entering the most heavily defended airspace. It's an unusual kind of power. Distance, not direct exposure, becomes the advantage. When these three elements move together, electronic disruption first, precision strike second, long-range mass impact third, the result is a layered attack that most traditional air defense systems were simply never designed to handle. Older defense networks were generally built to track individual aircraft approaching from a single direction. They were not built to track dozens of separate threats arriving simultaneously from multiple directions at low altitude. That mismatch is central to understanding why this campaign has proven so difficult for Iran's defense systems to counter. There's also a quieter piece of tonight's story that rarely gets attention: logistics. None of these aircraft can operate for long without fuel, and sustained campaigns like this one depend heavily on aerial refueling support. Reports over the past 48 hours indicating the repositioning of American refueling aircraft closer to the region are typically read by analysts as a signal in themselves. It suggests preparation for continued operations, not a single isolated event. More fuel support in the region almost always means more missions are coming, not fewer. Now let's talk about what's happening on the other side of this, because how Tehran responds tonight tells us almost as much as the strikes themselves. Inside Iran, the public response has followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched this conflict unfold over recent months. Strong statements delivered quickly, aimed as much at an internal audience as at Washington. Officials described tonight's strikes as a violation of prior understandings, language carefully chosen to suggest that some kind of informal boundary existed before tonight, whether that boundary was ever formally agreed upon or simply implied through months of limited engagement. What matters more than whether that boundary was real is the function this kind of statement serves domestically. It gives leadership something to say. It gives the public something to hold on to. Iranian officials described the American response as carrying consequences that would go, in their words, beyond what is currently expected. Language broad enough to suggest almost anything without committing to anything specific. This is a familiar pattern in conflicts where one side holds significantly less military capability than the other. Vague, dramatic rhetoric tends to fill the space where concrete options have narrowed. Still, some of what came out of Tehran tonight deserves closer attention rather than dismissal. Officials suggested that a significant portion of Iran's remaining military capability has not yet been deployed. This isn't an unusual claim to make during an active conflict, but it raises a fair question. If true, why hasn't it been used already, especially after more than a week of sustained losses? And if it isn't true, what purpose does the claim serve beyond reassuring a domestic audience that the situation remains under control? There were also references tonight to the possibility of new fronts opening, including suggestions involving military installations in neighboring countries. Analysts have responded to these statements with caution rather than alarm. Expanding a conflict into new territory requires coordination, resources, and air capability that Iran has struggled to consistently demonstrate throughout this entire campaign. A statement is not the same thing as a capability. This gap between rhetoric and demonstrated ability has defined much of Iran's public posture throughout this conflict, even as its military infrastructure has been steadily degraded, strike after strike, night after night. That contrast isn't unusual for a government facing significant internal pressure. Leadership groups that rise through military and security institutions often lean heavily on forceful language during moments of weakness, precisely because maintaining public confidence at home matters just as much as outcomes on the battlefield abroad. There's also a quieter risk running underneath all of this that deserves real attention: the risk of miscalculation. When ballistic missiles are launched toward one target but intercepted near another nation's border, when debris falls into neighboring territory, or when regional allies find themselves unexpectedly caught in the middle of strikes aimed elsewhere, the possibility of unintended escalation grows substantially. Conflicts rarely stay contained simply because both sides intend for them to. Sometimes they expand because of accidents, miscommunication, or the simple, unforgiving reality of geography. Recent incidents involving missile debris landing outside intended target zones illustrate this risk clearly. One miscalculated intercept, one misfired missile. That's often all it takes to pull additional countries directly into a conflict that, until now, has remained largely between two primary parties. This is the part of modern warfare that rarely makes it into official statements, but weighs heavily on military planners nonetheless: the space between intention and consequence. For Iran's leadership, every additional night of strikes chips away at both military capability and public narrative control simultaneously. The challenge becomes maintaining an image of strength and resistance, even as tangible capability continues to shrink beneath them. This is an extraordinarily difficult balance to hold, and historically, it becomes harder to maintain the longer a conflict like this continues to unfold. Now let's zoom out, because tonight's events did not happen in isolation, even though the world's attention has been almost entirely fixed on Iran. Thousands of miles away, in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, a separate but significant strike occurred during this same general window. Ukrainian forces launched a large coordinated drone strike deep into Russian territory, targeting facilities tied to the production and supply chain of Russian military drones. Reports indicate the strikes hit logistics centers responsible for critical components, causing both casualties and substantial damage far from that war's traditional front lines. Why does that matter to a story about Iran? Because it reveals something important about the current global environment. Multiple serious conflicts are unfolding simultaneously right now, each demanding attention, resources, and high-level decision-making from the same set of major powers at the exact same time. This isn't a coincidence of timing. It reflects a broader reality where military and political leadership in Washington are being forced to manage more than one crisis at once, with finite attention and finite resources stretched across multiple regions. For the United States specifically, this creates a genuinely difficult balancing act. Military assets committed to one theater are, by definition, not available in another. When officials describe repositioning refueling aircraft or shifting long-range bombers into a particular region, they are making real choices about where American power is concentrated at any given moment. Every decision to reinforce one front carries an implicit cost somewhere else on the map. This is precisely why analysts pay such close attention, not just to what gets struck, but to what gets moved, repositioned, or quietly held in reserve. These logistical decisions frequently reveal more about long-term strategic intentions than any public statement ever will. So where does this go from here? There are generally three broad paths a conflict at this stage tends to follow, and each carries its own distinct set of signals. The first path is continued escalation. Under this scenario, strikes continue at a similar or increased pace. Additional capabilities are introduced into the campaign, and rhetoric on both sides remains sharp and uncompromising. Historically, this path tends to continue until one side experiences a significant shift in capability, leadership, or domestic pressure that forces a change in course. The second path is negotiated de-escalation. This typically emerges once the cost of continued conflict becomes difficult for one or both sides to sustain, whether through military losses, mounting economic pressure, or diplomatic intervention from outside parties. Under this scenario, strikes gradually slow, public rhetoric softens, and back-channel discussions often begin quietly, long before any of it becomes public knowledge. The third path is expansion, a scenario where the conflict grows beyond its current boundaries, potentially drawing in additional countries, additional military platforms, or entirely new geographic fronts. This path is generally considered less likely in the immediate term, given the resource and coordination challenges involved, but it absolutely cannot be dismissed, particularly if miscalculation or an unintended incident occurs along one of the many existing fault lines in the region. For those trying to genuinely understand where this heads next, certain indicators matter far more than official statements. Continued movement of long-range aircraft and refueling support usually signals sustained operations rather than isolated action. Expanded diplomatic travel warnings often indicate that officials privately expect the security environment to worsen before it improves. And shifts in the language used by military officials, from cautious to direct, from defensive to explicitly retaliatory, frequently reflect strategic changes well before those changes are ever publicly confirmed. Taken together, these signals offer a far more reliable picture of where this conflict is heading than any single press briefing or public statement possibly could. What's clear, based on everything we've examined tonight, is that the situation surrounding Iran is no longer defined by isolated incidents happening in a vacuum. It has evolved into a sustained, multi-layered military operation, running in parallel with other significant global conflicts, each one drawing on limited attention and limited resources from the exact same set of major powers. Whether this leads toward further escalation, a shift toward quiet diplomacy behind closed doors, or an unexpected expansion into new territory will likely depend less on the public statements coming out of Tehran or Washington, and far more on the operational decisions being made quietly in the background. Decisions involving aircraft positioning, logistical support, and strategic priorities being weighed across multiple regions simultaneously. For now, the pattern remains consistent. Strikes continue, rhetoric intensifies, and the world watches closely, waiting to see which of these three paths ultimately becomes reality. That's where the story stands tonight. Not at its conclusion, but at a genuine turning point, one whose direction will likely become clearer in the days immediately ahead. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is moving fast, and I'll be here breaking down every development as it happens.